What's going on, everybody? My name's Alec, and in today's video, I'm going to be bringing you the scope tier list. So these have all of the scopes in Rainbow Six Siege. It is missing one scope though, and that is the 2.5x on the Russian operators. So there is a 2.5x scope, the 2.5x B. That is the only scope that is missing, but I'll substitute that in for like a different scope later at the end of the video. But with that out of the way, that's pretty much it for the intro. Let's just get straight into it. First of all, going into the Reflex A, I'm going to give the Reflex A a solid A tier. The Reflex A, if you actually look at the math of like how little it takes up of the screen, but how much of the glass there is and how little the reticle is, so it makes you able to see how much of the player it is. Like, if you do the actual math of how much screen to glass to optic value there is, this is by far the best scope in the entire game in terms of actual math. But in terms of like comfortability and how easy it is to use and how good it looks, it's a solid A tier, right? Not the best. Mathematically, it kind of is the best, but I don't really like it personally. The only thing that I don't really like about it is with this sight specifically, it's a triangle, right? Let me zoom in on this so you can kind of see. It's a little triangle like this, right? And so with this triangle, the bullets don't appear in the center of the optic like on every other sight. It appears at the top of the triangle right here. This is where your bullets are going to come out of the sight. And it's like that with every single other reflex sight in the entire game. And that's kind of the only thing that I don't like about it, is the fact that it appears at the top of the triangle. It's a bit weird to get used to shooting the top of the optic and not the center of the optic. If it wasn't like that, it would probably be everybody's favorite sight and probably be the best sight in the game, but it's, you know, it's not. So solid A tier for sure. Going into the next one, we have the Holo B, which first appeared on Mozzie's Roni, and then, you know, soon since became a fan favorite once it was released on all the weapons. That being said, solid S tier for me. I think in terms of how it feels when you use it, it's very good. The actual like optic itself doesn't take up too much on your screen. The actual casing, not very much compared to something like an ACOG, right? And then the reticle is very, very thin with a very thin dot in the center, so it feels very good to use because you can actually see the head that you're trying to click. And overall, it's just like a very, very fun sight to use, very good sight to use, and that is why I like it so much. Going into our next pick is going to be the 2.5 times scope. Now, this is going to be a very hot take, but I want you to at least hear me out before I say this. I think this is a solid B tier scope. Now, most people would probably put it in A tier. If you're on console or you're new to the game, you'd probably be putting it in S. That being said, I think it's a solid B tier pick, along with the 2.5B also being a solid B tier. That one I think could be A tier, but for now the A is B tier. And the reason I'm saying that is because it's a fucking zoomed in scope, bro. It is so zoomed in. It's honestly too zoomed in. We as Siege players recently have had the luxury of being able to play with scopes like the 1.5 and the 2x, and then we switched to something like the 2.5A and the 2.5B, and it's just so much, especially on smaller maps. This thing can actually be more of a nuisance than it can be a help whenever you're trying to zoom into players. And then also, if you're really good at the game, every single pro player, challenger league player, everybody that's probably like platinum above in Siege on PC uses the aspect ratio 4:3, and they have an FOV of 90. And with those certain settings, the 2.5 times scope is way more zoomed in than it would be without those settings. And because of that, the 2.5 times scope for PC and for those settings feels like Kali's sniper scope, like way too much. And the 1.5 feels like an ACOG to us. So that's the reason why you're going to see me put the 1.5x so high on the tier list. Now, if you have normal settings, you're on 16:9, your FOV is base, you're on console, you're new to the game, S tier for sure. But I just wanted to get it out the way. Once you're good at the game, you have a solid aspect ratio and FOV, the actual value of this scope does go down to a B tier. The next one that I'm going to talk about is the red dot. There could be an argument for B tier here, or C tier. It doesn't really matter to me. The only thing that really makes this scope bad is the fact that there's so much on the right side of the scope here. There's this dial, there's the dial on the right here, and then there's a dial on the top as well. Like, just a clunky scope. And then the optic is a bit too small and the scope takes up a lot of space. But other than that, I like the fact that there's a lot of glass in the actual optic that you can see through, and having that small of a scope, you know, isn't really that bad, to be honest. So, you know, solid scope for sure. Definitely not anything like the 1.5, the 2x, the Holo B, or the Reflex A, but it's a solid scope on certain guns. Now going into the Holo B, or the Holo C, I think actually. This is the Cybertruck Holo. Gonna be an F tier for me. This thing is super thick, super tall. The sight is not very good. There's two lines. The two lines are just getting in the way, right? And then for certain settings as well, certain visual settings, the two lines right here on the sight get very blurry instead of just being solid lines, especially if you're on low settings, which can actually be quite a nuisance. So I don't really like the sight all that much. I think it's a pretty terrible sight, and you know, that's pretty much all I have to say about that. Going into the red dot A, this is going to be a C tier pick for me. The red dot A, again, like the red dot C, is just a clunky red dot sight. All of this on the right, very clunky. It's just a very big scope, but you know, the center dot is very good for some people who are very accurate. The amount of glass that you get to be able to actually see the enemies is pretty cool, but that's about all it has going for it. It's a huge sight that takes up a lot of your screen, and I find myself getting in the way with this scope. Like, there will be some people that are just covered by the scope that kill me that I can't see because the scope is so big, right? Same thing with the ACOGs. That's why it's a C tier pick for me. Going into it, let's get into some good scopes, right? We have the Reflex C, the Russian Reflex. This has got to be a solid A tier for me. I think this is a great A tier sight. Some people might even say S tier, but they did nerf it to make the scope actually bigger on your screen, and that brought it down to A tier for me. I think it probably was the best scope in the game before they nerfed it. Even better than Reflex A, honestly, because it was so small. Solid A tier for now. I mean, the scope's beautiful, right? You don't have to worry about the whole, like, mindfuck of the bullet coming at the top of the triangle instead of in the center, because these two lines kind of help your brain with that. The glass amount is very good. The actual amount that it takes up on your screen is not bad because there's the circle and a little bit of square on the left right here. But other than that, I mean, it's a pretty chill scope, very easy to use, very good for low recoil weapons as well. I'm sorry, high recoil weapons, right? Because these two lines, for some reason, just help my brain control recoil better. I don't know why, but on high recoil guns, the Reflex C just kind of pops off. And then we have the 3x scope. This comes on most DMRs, I think all DMRs in the entire game. I think this is probably a C tier, if not an F tier scope. Now, I know what you're saying. It's a zoomed in scope. How can it be bad, bro? It's too zoomed in. Like, maps like Bank, maybe Theme Park, maybe Chalet, where it's long and there's a lot of open space and tight angles that you can hold, sure, right? But then considering that these scopes only come on like DMRs where there's a lot of recoil, it's very hard to rein in this scope. This scope also takes up a lot of space on your screen. There's not a lot of glass where you can see the enemies in because the optic is so much, right? There's one ring, there's 4 crosshairs, and then there's 4 little square crosshairs in the middle of that as well, if you can't see these 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a center dot that's not really visible on the screen as of right now, but it's too much. It is too much. I will say it's not as bad as the other F tier pick that I have, so, you know, I'll put it in C tier for people who really like 3x scope. I'm just not that guy, personally. Honestly, I would rather put it in F tier, but there is a case where it can be used properly, so I'll put it in the very bottom of C tier for now. Next, we have the 1.5x scope. Now, because of people playing on 4.3 and using 90 FOV and people fragging out a lot, this is by far the best scope in the entire game, the 1.5. People can make an argument for 2x. People that make the argument for 2x are typically people with low settings that like the ACOG but feel like the ACOG is too much, so they use the 2x. I can agree, and on low recoil weapons, the 2x actually is pretty good, especially on certain maps. Great example being Zero's gun with the 2x. You can use it on Chalet and it's a fucking monster, right? So not dissing the 2x at all, but I think the 1.5 is more reliable and better in most situations. Again, I mean, just look at this thing. Take a little gander, right? Takes up almost none of your screen. The reticle is not much. It's a little ring with a dot inside and a line below, and the amount of glass that you have is still very forgiving. So I think the scope is very good. You can use it on any range of any gunfight, close quarters, medium range, long range, anything like that, especially if you have the correct settings, which is what I've been talking about this entire time, right? 4.3 with 90 FOV. This thing is an absolute monster. You look at any pro player, you look at the best aimers in the entire world, Spoit, people like fucking Pigeon, Braction, all of them, they have great aim, and they all use 1.5x scopes because it's just a better version of the ACOG. So definitely an S tier pick for me, zero dispute. Going into our next sight, we're gonna have the Holo D. Now, the Holo D is not too terrible. I want to put it in C tier. Most people would put it in F tier. You know, I agree. It kind of is a shit sight. If you want to put it there, fine, go ahead. But to its defense, it actually, in terms of the math of how big the scope is, let's take a look. It's actually a pretty small scope. It's very thin. It is very tall, but not much taller than the Holo B, right? So the tallness doesn't really matter. The only thing that sucks about this scope really is the actual inside portion. There's barely any glass, The reticle takes up a lot of the space. There's 3 lines and a circle, so you can really only see the inside, like with just like a pixel, right? So the actual reticle sucks ass. That's really the only thing that puts it all the way down here. But in terms of how much it takes up on your screen, it's not too bad. You know, like the Holo has everything wrong with it, while this just kind of has one terrible thing wrong with it, kind of like the red dot and the 3x. So bottom of C tier. There can be an argument for F tier. If you want to say that, go ahead. You know, no hard feelings there. I completely agree. Next, we have the Holo A. This is good old reliable. This was the most used scope until they introduced the 1.5 and all of the other 1x optics in the game. I want to put this in S tier as well. I think it is a more reliable version of the Holo B. There is an argument, mathematically speaking, the Holo B is better, and sometimes I just feel like playing the Holo B and it just feels better. But the Holo A is more reliable. It's, you know, it's good or reliable, really. That's all it is. It's well-rounded in every single sense. It's got an okay amount of space that it takes up on your screen. The amount of glass is okay. The reticle size is okay. It's just kind of okay in all aspects, and that's what makes it reliable, and that's why people use it so often. Definite S tier for me. There could be an argument for A tier as well if you want to go there. I personally would just put it in S tier. And then we have the 2x scope. I'm going to put it in the top of A tier. I think the scope is amazing, like I said, just as good as 1.5. It is a bit too zoomed in though, but if you have a low recoil weapon and you're on a long range map, this thing is just as good, if not even better than the 1.5. There is an argument for S tier. Personally, I don't see it because, you know, a lot of guns have a lot of recoil, and there are certain maps where it's just very close quarters and it's too zoomed in, right? It's just too zoomed in, so 1.5 and 1x scopes just are better on some guns. Take Ying's LMG, for example, right? People only play Ying on really short, like close range maps, so having her with a 1.5 is just going to be the best option, even though she brings a 2x. Same thing with Zero if you're bringing him on a very small map. So, you know, it's still a great sight, but it's just not as good as the people above it, in my personal opinion. And that's why I'm putting it in the A tier. And then we have the Red Dot C, I think. Yeah, Red Dot C. Red Dot C is pretty underrated in terms of like how comfortable the scope can be. I'm honestly going to give it a solid A tier. Not as good as the 2 reflexes here. Maybe better than this reflex, but I mean, you know, it's very close. This Red Dot is actually pretty good. It takes up a very, very small amount on your screen. Like the actual scope, very thin, very short. The only thing is the actual base of it right here that it attaches to your gun shoots out in front of you, so that's a bit big. Other than that, this thing is very well rounded. The optic is pretty good. There's a good amount of glass space. Like I said, just well rounded. Not as good as like the 1.5 or any of the Holos, but still a good sight. And then, like I said, the 2.5x B would be right here. I personally like it more than the 2.5x A. I know that the A is more nostalgic, and the scope, like the actual optic, is a triangle, so it's a bit easier to hit heads with. But I think the 2x B is a little bit more reliable in most gunfights because there's an actual dot in the center rather than there being a triangle, right? The 1.5 is the same thing where there's a circle and then a dot. Same thing on the 2.5xb. I kind of like it more. Most people will disagree with me on there because of the nostalgic value. B tier for sure for me. With that being said though, that's pretty much it for the entire tier list. I went over all of the scopes. If you disagree with anything that I have to say, especially about these B, C, and F picks, let me know in the comments. If you want to get coached by me, by the way, I do get paid to play this game and to make content for it by a pro team, Star6, if you can't tell by the logo in the top right of my screen. So you have somebody that's really good at the game that gets paid to play the game, coach you for free if you join my Discord server down below. Like the video if you liked it, sub to the channel. I'm almost at 4K. And with that out of the way, I'll see you in the next one. Later.